Well, thank you both so much for joining us this afternoon here in London. Perhaps it'd be great maybe if you'd just like to start introducing yourself, why you're in London, who you're representing, and we'll go from there.
Sure.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Jenna Saucedo-Herra, and I have the privilege of leading Greater SATX. We are the regional economic development organization representing San Antonio, Texas. And that's exactly what brought me here. We're here to tell companies all over the UK all about San Antonio, our value proposition, our high growth industries like cybersecurity, bioscience, and advanced manufacturing. And we've had a great visit so far.
Oh, that's fantastic, thank you. And this obviously comes on the back of Governor Abbott's visit last week to London and the successful signing of a trade agreement going forwards between Texas and the UK. And I read, I think it was only over the weekend, even I was unaware of just how big and already established the bilateral trade relationship between Texas and the United Kingdom is. I think we're your 9th largest
That's correct.
Investor and sort of exporter of Texan goods to the United Kingdom. And I think Texas is our 8th largest. And this obviously now represents such a large bilateral investment relationship going forwards. Where would you see, in regards to the agreement last week between Texas and the UK, where would you see the greater potential for further growth coming from?
Well, the trade agreement is significant and a great deal for us in San Antonio and really across Texas. And so, yes, all of the statistics you outlined were absolutely accurate. I would add, though, that right now, the number of foreign direct investment projects that we have in the state of Texas, the majority are coming out of the UK.
Well, that's really interesting because obviously San Antonio forms, one of at least 4 or 5 major large urban conurbations in Texas: Houston, Dallas, and obviously Austin. In terms of San Antonio and the greater San Antonio area, where do you see, or how do you see that really complementing the UK trade investment space compared to, say, the rest of Texas, in particular, Austin and Houston? What is it uniquely about San Antonio that presents the opportunity that we can all see going forwards?
Well, I appreciate the question because the state of Texas is large and it's very diverse, right? So, the governor touts quite frequently, as do we, that we're the 8th largest economy in the world, right? As a standalone, population size of about 30 million. San Antonio and our metropolitan statistical area, which is represented by about 8 surrounding counties, the population size is 2.6 million today. And it's also one of the fastest growing metro areas in the entire country. And what we have in San Antonio actually uniquely positions us not only within the state of Texas, but also within the country, in that we're centrally located in the state of Texas. So 60 minutes up north is Austin, and about 3 hours down south is Mexico. And so we're centrally located in the United States with close proximity to Latin America. So for global operations, right, that are looking to service customers at any given time, the central time zone makes a whole lot of sense. And then logistically for, capital intensive organizations like JCB out of the UK, and I'll come back to that, our advantageous geographic location makes a whole lot of sense. And so where we're located makes sense. The fact that we are one of the fastest growing communities in the country is great, right? Over 130 people move to San Antonio daily and over 1,000 people move to the state of Texas daily. We are top of the country for the number of corporate headquarters. We just surpassed California. And so the momentum is certainly on our side. As it relates to industries within San Antonio, one of our highest growth industries is cybersecurity. And so you're familiar given your background, but we have the United States 16th Air Force Cybersecurity Headquarters Command in San Antonio. We have the National Security Agency in San Antonio. And believe it or not, we have the highest concentration of cybersecurity professionals in San Antonio. They're the second largest concentration, only to the DC capital area. So behind DC, it's San Antonio, and we are it as it relates to cybersecurity. We also have a robust manufacturing ecosystem, which is why JCB, the third largest construction equipment manufacturer in the world, selected San Antonio for significant investment, about a $30 billion economic impact over the next 10 years and thousands of jobs in our local community. And then, as I mentioned previously, bioscience, a home of military medicine, and then all of the surrounding R&D that's related to that.
You've just touched on two really personal points to me, which is obviously my military past and my interest in manufacturing, particularly advanced manufacturing, and moving away from sort of hydrocarbons. But in terms of we spoke only earlier, just briefly before this interview, about the military footprint in San Antonio. I believe you said it was 80,000 active personnel are based in San Antonio. That's just for context. That's around 10% larger than the current numbers in the British Army. Mm-hmm. So it's absolutely enormous. Yeah, no, it's enormous. I don't know whether that's an indication of just how small the British Army is getting, but we can leave that for another chat. But no, so that's fascinating. And in terms of the cybersecurity element, both public and private sector, with the Air Force Strategic Command, the Cyber Command. But also, if I'm right in thinking, there's around 1,000, maybe just under or just over about 1,000 private cybersecurity companies based now in San Antonio.
That's correct.
That's absolutely huge, and that's such a big driver and such a big pull for UK investment, where we have our 2022 to 2030 cybersecurity strategy, which we're trying to implement. And I think there's a lot of private business in the UK, particularly on the cybersecurity front, which are really interested in driving that. And obviously now with this agreement and this framework with Texas, is there any way in particular that you see British inward investment into the cybersecurity industry within San Antonio specifically? Is there anything that you've seen over the last year whilst this has been coming to fruition going forwards? How do you see that relationship developing?
Absolutely. It's a great opportunity for us. In fact, the majority of companies that we visited with here in the UK are cybersecurity, information security types of organizations that are looking at scaling up their operations, right? They will remain headquartered in the UK, as they should, but scaling up their operations in North America and trying to figure out where the best site location makes sense for them. And San Antonio happens to be it, based in large part to the cybersecurity professionals that we have in San Antonio. And most companies are looking for, where can I find the talent, right, that's going to meet our needs? And as I mentioned earlier, San Antonio has the largest joint base in the United States. And so annually, we see about 2,000 veterans retiring out of active duty. And that's 2,000 folks that majority of them have clearances and have the skill sets, right, because we have the 16th and other locations there in San Antonio to support these types of cybersecurity companies. So we welcome their investment and look forward to supporting their growth in the United States.
Well, one of the things you just highlighted there, which is really paramount for UK manufacturing and trade domestically, is this lack that we have in some quarters of like a skilled workforce. And it's really hampering UK businesses, particularly SMEs. So in terms of like, that's such a large skills base already in San Antonio and Texas more widely. I imagine that's been an incredibly appealing pull for British investment, talking about the skilled workforce that are already there in San Antonio. Are there existing partnerships that you've seen develop with sort of the education space between public and private sector to help that skilled workforce, particularly in cybersecurity? Or is it quite heavily reliant on, like you mentioned, previous military service personnel? Or is there local partnerships that are really developing, like I say, for the cybersecurity, the skills base needed to drive that investment to bring it into San Antonio?
It's certainly the latter. There are a lot of partnerships at play. So we have, the way that we're structured in San Antonio and at Greater SATX is that we have some of our largest academic institutions. So the University of Texas San Antonio, their president serves on our board with the other leaders of some of our largest private organizations. And that's because there's alignment around these target industries that we aim to grow. This isn't a 1 year, 2 year strategy. This is a long-term 5 to 10 year strategic growth growth plan where we know we're positioning for cybersecurity. We know we're positioning for bioscience and manufacturing. And so there's a lot of information exchange, but even further, we've actually passed, and this is unprecedented in the United States, but we passed a voter-approved, tax-funded workforce program, not a new tax, but a reallocated tax to the tune of about $250 million to train up San Antonians that might be underemployed or in different industries. And we're subsidizing the cost specifically for these certifications in the in-demand occupations that we're growing. And it's called Ready to Work. Again, voter approved. It was Mayor Ron Nierenberg's big initiative. It's just getting off the ground now, but it is coupled with, say they get a 2-year certification, it's coupled with programs at the University of Texas, San Antonio, at Texas A&M San Antonio, where these San Antonians can actually get 4-year degrees in cybersecurity or what have you, financial services, some sort of career path, and ideally work for some of our fastest growing employers. In addition to that, the University of Texas at San Antonio has the #1 degree certification for cyber professionals in the country. And we're very proud of that.
All right. Wow. Fascinating. Just to go back slightly, you mentioned the $250 million tax initiative to help train up San Antonians. That's an interesting case study in itself of how sort of like a devolved power from the federal government down to the state level in terms of like with taxes and tax breaks and issues like that. Is that widely popular across the rest of the United States, or is that something quite specific to Texas and to San Antonio in particular, do you think?
It is quite specific to San Antonio, to be specific. This is unprecedented. Nothing like this has ever been passed in the United States, especially to the significant financial investment. It's just not a typical American type of program. But right now, the conversations about workforce, even though our population is growing significantly, right, the job counts are growing at the same rate, the same pace. And so it's important that we prioritize specifically getting those individuals the transferable skill sets for the demand occupations that we're creating and that we're growing. Because we don't necessarily, in the States, we don't have a people problem. We certainly don't have a jobs problem, but it's just connecting those people to the opportunities and making sure they're skilling up. And at the end of the day, there's a narrative about economic mobility and providing these Americans and San Antonians, career pathways, and what I like to call is pathways to prosperity. They have the ability to provide for their families, break down generational cycles of poverty, and it truly is not just a job program or a workforce program, it's an economic mobility program, in my opinion.
That's very interesting indeed. Could you talk a little bit more about the defense and aerospace industry in San Antonio? I'm aware, like I mentioned with previous military experience, just how great that is in Texas in general, but with San Antonio in particular, the defense and aerospace industry, how big of a part has that played in upscaling, not just the skilling, but the local economy, and in particular bringing this into sort of like a British investment and trade space? Where do you see the opportunities? Are there challenges still, particularly considering there isn't an overall federal sort of trade deal between the two countries, but this is obviously state level and national level. Where do you see the opportunities for defence and aerospace going forwards in relation to British investment?
Well, as we've discussed previously, the level of investment from the United States Department of Defense in San Antonio and in the San Antonio region is vast. So we have almost every branch of the military represented, and as we mentioned, several active duty personnel in San Antonio, a lot of even retired generals relocating back into San Antonio because, as you probably know, every airman in the United States Air Force is trained at the AETC in San Antonio. So you're familiar with San Antonio, you've been trained there, you've been stationed there, or something to that effect. And so they continue to invest in our community. Right now, they are scaling up the Defense Health Agency. So those skill sets, we're already military, we're home of military medicine. And so the Defense Health Agency additions, if you will, just continues to bring that same type of skill set that we're looking to grow in San Antonio. So when I think about UK companies that are interested, again, in scaling up within the United States, San Antonio, because of our pace and rate of growth, it makes sense to scale up with a community like San Antonio. So you'll find the talent, right? You will find a pro-business environment. You will find a political environment that I think is complementary. to the UK. And at the end of the day, I think that you'll find that your customer base and the opportunities to grow that customer base is also pretty significant. And so that's the reason for investing. And then, of course, organizations like ours, and certainly the Governor's Office of Economic Development, we help to support those types of companies looking to make investments and help navigate them through starting up, scaling up within America.
Okay, great, thank you. If we look at the framework that was discussed last week or signed last week between the Prime Minister here and Governor Abbott in Texas, there's been a lot of talk about reducing the trade barriers between both Texan manufacturers and businesses and those in Britain. And obviously being mindful of the fact this isn't, like I mentioned, a federal agreement. This is local to Texas. And in particular, one thing that was discussed was a wider recognition of British qualifications. In terms of, again, going forwards, is there any information you're privy to, or in terms of that you're aware that will be coming out as this progresses, in terms of how those qualifications will be recognised in Texas more, and also the idea of reducing the trade barriers that exist between, or previously existed between, the two entities. Going forwards, how can that be enacted? How can we reduce trade barriers to increase both bilateral investment and British investment into particularly San Antonio, or San Antonian companies? And again, the recognition of British qualifications going forwards as well.
I think we're still learning, right? So this was just last week. We're on the heels of that trip, just a couple of days after. So I think we're still learning what that looks like. But opening up the lines of communication, having conversations like the governor and the prime minister are having, I think is a step in the right direction. Now, of course, we have a big election this year. You all have a big election this year. And so I think a lot is yet to be determined in the very near future. But that's why I think it's so important that at the state level and at the local community level, we're reaching out on our own to have these types of conversations. We're not waiting for the federal government to make these decisions or to enact any sort of changes that would make it easier to do business. We're reaching out on our own. And we have a lot of, I say we, the governor has a lot of the authority at the state level to not just sign these agreements, but to activate and operationalize agreements like this, which is what I'm looking forward to and why we're here just the week after it was signed.
No, it's incredibly interesting and exciting looking forwards. And you mentioned, obviously, both of our elections, probably both likely sometime in November, in the autumn, the fall. In terms of, I don't want to steer this conversation towards, obviously, too political regarding either likely presidential candidate. But in terms of, there is wide speculation, or there has been wide speculation here in Britain before, that a Republican or a Trump, dare I say it, administration would be more favourable than a Democratic administration for an overall free trade agreement with Britain. But whilst I don't want to necessarily focus on that, because that's a known unknown, the idea of these state level trade agreements with, I think now this is our 8th with an American state, with Texas, and you rightly mentioned earlier just how big of a deal that is for Britain in terms of the size and the scale, and also the growth opportunities in Texas, and represented by San Antonio in particular. So it's incredibly exciting moving forwards, and a lot of people now don't really want to speculate too much on a free trade agreement with America, but carrying on these state level agreements across America. Would you have any sort of advice or best practice, or what things have worked in your experience for getting the agreement with Texas over the line? Because I know obviously this has been building on previous discussions over in the summer when we had Governor Abbott's wife come over to the UK on his behalf, and those agreements have carried on for over a year. But in terms of how these can be replicated, the best practice that you've seen from your perspective from the San Antonian approach, what would you say has worked really well, and possibly what could work not better, but where could these be developed in the future with other states hoping to replicate deals with the UK?
So I was actually with our First Lady on that last trip here to the UK, and I typically travel with the governor, as do several of my peers around the state of Texas. I think first and foremost, elect the right leaders that are pro-business, pro-economic development. But the way that economic development is structured in Texas actually makes it conducive for us to have these types of conversations all over the world, right? So we're having conversations in the UK. We're also going to be in South Korea this year, Japan this year. We were just in India with the governor in January of this year. And so where the industries we're trying to grow, where the geographic investments make sense, we're there and we're figuring that out. But the way that we're structured in the state of Texas, because we are so large and spread out, economic development is decentralized. And so what happens is Governor Abbott has his Office of Economic Development, and Adriana Cruz and her team, they are the best economic development professionals and team in the country, in my humble opinion. But they are coupled with a sister organization that is funded by private industry, and that's the Texas Economic Development Corporation, led by Aaron Demerson. And so we, as an organization and multiple other private organizations, invest in the Texas Economic Development Corporation to help us market around the world. And so it's an interesting model, kind of a private-public model, where Adriana and her team get to do what they do on project management and deal flow, but coupled with a marketing approach actually fuels us to have more business development related conversations versus kind of just the bureaucratic kind of policy types of discussions. So I think that dynamic is what has enabled Texas to be relevant in these types of conversations and that have allowed us to get these types of SMCs over the goal line.
That's really interesting.
Statements of mutual cooperation.
Sure. No, it's interesting when you point to the different geographical areas, and particularly the devolved or the decentralized nature of the Texas economy and the Texas local level government. In terms of, you touched on earlier with JCB and sort of my interest in UK manufacturing. I actually grew up not far from JCB sort of headquarters in England.
Oh, really?
Yeah, lovely little town called Uttoxeter in rural Staffordshire. But in terms of, you highlighted that as an area of like manufacturing, my interest in advanced manufacturing, particularly with bioscience and biomedicine. How do you see that moving forwards with San Antonio and Britain? Like, have you had conversations, obviously with JCB or with manufacturers in the UK? What are they really excited about? What are their interests? And how do you see plugging that investment into the San Antonian economy?
Well, I'd love to learn that you grew up around that area. It's absolutely beautiful. So I've had the privilege of visiting their corporate headquarters a few times, and it's beautiful. And we hope to replicate that type of campus in San Antonio and that type of working environment. But we're absolutely having conversations with other manufacturers. And the same reason that JCB has elected to invest in San Antonio, right? Because the competitive cost of doing business, the favorable tax environment, the workforce, as you previously mentioned, and ideally the supply chain as well, which is the second conversation. That's the phase 2 of conversations with JCB, because at this point, now we're going to have to stand up their entire supply chain, right? Same conversations that we had back when Toyota invested in San Antonio and when Navistar, which is a Volkswagen truck company, invested in San Antonio, or Tesla right up the road. This is why manufacturing is so ideal for us, because there's a multiplier effect. You bring in a manufacturer and you have to build out the supply chains around them. And so these are high capital intensive operations, which makes sense. They're there for the long term, but we get to build out an entire ecosystem around them. And so specifically as it relates to JCB, we're going to need to have conversations with their suppliers. They're going to have to determine, do they relocate suppliers? Do they develop suppliers in North America? And the conversations continue. So I think it's a great opportunity for additional manufacturers to look at the San Antonio market, whether or not you're a supplier to JCB. It still probably makes sense. So we look forward to having those conversations.
No, for sure. So one of the things you mentioned, you highlighted on a moment ago, which was really interesting, is I was maybe a bit presumptuous and I jumped the gun almost with regards to the lowering of trade barriers and the UK qualifications, bearing in mind this agreement has only just been inked. If we look at instead the secondary and the third effects of this trade deal for Texas and British investment in terms of the secondary and the third effects. So what happens next in terms of, you touched on with JCB, for example, the supply chains for manufacturing, will they need to be relocated? How do they reorganize their supply chains? Investing into Texas and bringing business into Texas. How do you see the next steps for that regards to either maybe the automation industry or defense or aerospace? How do you see those secondary and third steps? What happens next for British manufacturing and for British trade to carry on that, to improve this investment, increase this investment into particularly the San Antonio region?
Well, JCB will be a good model to follow, right, as they are going through the process now. So they've made the decision to locate in San Antonio proper. They're bringing thousands of jobs, big capital investment. And then the next step will be supply mapping, right? And then either sourcing or developing those suppliers within the market, right? Because the idea is that they are reducing their cost per unit produced. And that means that you want those suppliers in close proximity. What we've seen happen with organizations like Tesla, Navistar, Toyota that I previously mentioned, locating within not just San Antonio proper, but the broader mega region. So San Antonio anchors a mega region up north into Austin, down south into Monterrey, Mexico. And I believe that that employment corridor will be one of the most dynamic employment corridors in the world within the next 10 years, because these companies are having to build out those supply chains within the area. So you can imagine that, JCB operates in San Antonio, but their suppliers could be in surrounding communities like New Braunfels and San Marcos, or all the way up in Austin. And the same can be said for Tesla, right? Tesla has a perimeter of where they need their suppliers to locate. San Antonio is in that perimeter. And Tesla is also investing in Monterrey, Mexico, another gigafactory. And so between those three communities and all of the smaller communities in between, we all stand to benefit from that. So as far as next steps, I think next steps are to have the conversations, right? And to follow JCB's example of investing and scaling in North America. There will be lessons learned across the board, things that went well, maybe things that didn't go so well. But I think together, we're supporting that level of foreign direct investment and trade, and ideally living up to the statement of mutual cooperation that the governor signed.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. I think the multiplier effect and the levelling up and the scaling up you've just highlighted is one of the most interesting and, for me, exciting parts of this, is how we see this grow going forwards in Texas. So that's fascinating. I think in the interest of time, we're going to have to conclude there, but I just want to take this opportunity, Jennifer, thank you again for making the time to come and see us. I know how busy your schedule is in London this week, so I really appreciate it. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.